This is the official start. And I want to wish all of you a very happy Halloween early. And we are here on, what is it, the 26th of October. And we're so honored to have Professor Wolfgang Fink, who is one of the world's leading researchers on the digital restoration of eyesight and various maladies that can affect the retina and the optic nerve. So this is not only science, this is material for science fiction. We have seen Geordi on Star Trek: The Next Generation, I think it was that one, who had the glasses and he was using some sort of a digitally or other technology restored vision. So there are many potentials here for science fiction writers. So it's not only what's the here and now, but also Wolfgang is a big science fiction reader and fan. So he certainly understands both sides of this, unlike, some of the science people we have are only in the world of today's science. So with that, oh, and I should say specifically what Wolfgang's credits are. I'm not going to list them all, but he has worked with NASA. He has an endowed chair at the University of Arizona's electrical and computer engineering department, I should say. I always get titles of departments wrong, so pardon me if I did. And many awards and patents, and he's just bursting with good ideas and practical ideas that reach out into the future. So with that, I am honored to turn it over to you, and I will stop my share here. Okay, so.
Well, thank you very much, Gloria, for the kind invitation. This is the second time I have the pleasure to present to this group. Can you all hear me first and foremost? And can you all see the slides?
Yep.
Can yes. Please get a confirmation?
Well, we may have Excellent. A couple listeners who cannot see the slides, but that is, we have an what do you call it? We're inclusive. We have people who will be hearing your talk.
Okay, that's wonderful. Again, we chose the more Shakespearean topic, to see or not to see. That is the question for today. And of course, it concerns all of us. And because we all have eyes, and as we grow older, there may be one or two conditions which we may be facing. Some are almost inevitable, for example, cataract. That's a function of age. Let's see if I can advance the slide. Yeah. So I'm also showcasing the biomedical research in my Visual and Autonomous Exploration Systems Research Laboratory at the university, which was started at Caltech, JPL, NASA, and continued at the University of Arizona. As it is customary for any scientific talk, I have to present full disclosures. As Gloria mentioned, most of the technologies and techniques and things which I will be talking about are already patented. So you see here a list of patents, and there were also 2 startup companies which I have been involved with, just in full disclosure. And here is the subject of our talk today, the human eye. And before we get into more details, let me give you a very brief overview. I know some of you have to leave a little bit early, so you may miss some of the later parts of the talk. But we will be starting off familiarizing ourselves with the optics of the eye and sort of what the visual impression is, which we work with on a daily basis. Then we will work ourselves to the areas of the optic nerve and talk a little bit about intraocular pressure sensor development to assist glaucoma therapy. Then we'll not talk about hyperspectral imaging today, but we will spend some time on artificial vision through retinal implants. This is where the Geordi LaForge reference is. But retinal implants are actually a reality. And then towards the end, we'll talk about a worldwide accessible visual field test and diagnosis system to diagnose optical or retinal diseases early on. And we'll conclude with smartphone-based telemedicine, since our smartphones become more and more capable these days. So what I'm reporting on is literally pretty much 30 years of research in and around vision and ophthalmology in my lab at various locations. And we set out at the very beginning to actually simulate optical eye defects such that everyone, even the ones who are lucky enough and fortunate enough to not suffer from any defects, can participate in the visual experience of people suffering from certain optical or so-called refractive eye defects. And they can be very simple, such as nearsightedness, farsightedness, things like that. Well, first and foremost, here's the eye. The eye, just to capture some of the most important components, you have the cornea here, where you have the transition between air and the inner parts of the eye. A lot of refraction takes place here. You have the anterior chamber where my cursor is. Then this is very important. You have here the iris, and the hole inside the iris is actually the pupil. The iris is what gives the eye its color, and it's often confused. Colloquially, people call the pupil what gives the eye the color, but that's actually not the case. It's actually the hole, the opening, the aperture in the iris, which is the pupil. Then you have the so-called crystalline lens, which when you suffer from cataract, excuse me, becomes more clouded over time and then needs to be extracted or replaced. And then you have the so-called vitreous cavity, and light, which goes through the entire system, ultimately comes to rest on the retina, which is sort of the photosensor of the eye, gets processed there, there's significant processing going on, and then the signals leave the optic nerve, and then it goes into the visual cortex, V1 from V5, till we actually arrive at what we call visual perception. So we set out to develop a three-dimensional ray tracing technique, which I will explain in the following. And in order to understand this schematic, let's break it down. So as you have an object, let's say a letter F somewhere in space, and it's illuminated, so it sends out light. As this light comes towards the eye, you see the reflection of the F on the cornea, the front of the eye. It undergoes refraction at that interface via Snell's law. And what ultimately happens is the image gets turned upside down, left, right, inverted, and that's how it gets to rest on the retina. So actually, we see the world upside down and left, right, inverted. However, what happens then is that the neurosciences kick in, the retinal processing kicks in, the signal leaves the optic nerve, goes into the visual cortex, and through subsequent processing, the letter is right side up again, and we perceive the letter F. So basically what we perceive is not what is received by the eye on the retinas. It's quite important. And this where I circle with the cursor, that processing is of course very complex processing where there's still a lot to be understood and researched, but we will actually use a trick to not have to deal by and large with this complicated processing in order to arrive at the visual perception of a person. And here's how. We're now looking at an eye where the cornea is distorted, and that gives rise to astigmatism, irregular astigmatism. So some of you, some of us may wear glasses, contact lenses, and so forth. So you're quite familiar with nearsightedness, farsightedness, or distortion thanks to astigmatism or irregular astigmatism. So you see that the letter F, the light is coming towards the cornea, and you see now a more sort of crooked, distorted version of that letter because of the irregular shape of the cornea. And Snell's law, of course, still holds true. So you undergo refraction, and you end up now with a upside down, left, right, inverted, distorted version of the letter F. Now, what's important is the distortion we introduced and we're trying to study is only an optical one. So basically, if you liken it to a camera, we're only tweaking, or we're only introducing a defect in the lens of the camera, but not in the film or CCD chip of the camera. That means the retina is receiving the image, and the neural processing subsequently is not affected at all by the optic defect. So the neural processing is still the same, and therefore we see the letter F distorted. And that is when you take your glasses off, for example, or take your contact lenses off. Now, how do we show a person who's not suffering from eye defects what a person with eye defects actually sees, how they see the world? Well, here's the so-called Gedanken experiment, which we actually realized and programmed. All I need to do, or the basic assumption which goes into this, is the following. By and large, and this is an assumption, but it's a fairly decent one, by and large, the retinal processing from the retina to the visual cortex, to the visual perception, is for the most part roughly the same in all of us. And the reason for that basic assumption is if that wasn't the case, then somebody would see a tree for a car, a house for a car, and things like that. So there would be a lot more chaos in the world than we have already if we couldn't settle on some very basic commonalities or basic perceptions. So the assumption for this is, for the remainder of this presentation, that the processing is roughly the same. So all I need to do then is, let's say if I have the optical defect, I need to just translate or instill in your eyes, if your eyes were perfect, the same retinal image from my eye, and I instill it into your eye on the left side. If that was the case, then with the assumed similar processing, you would then also see the letter F distorted, if I were to be able to distill it directly. Now, here comes the trick. Optical pathways can be reversed. So we use now in your normal eye the distorted retinal image, and we backtrace it out of the optics through the eye backwards to the healthy eye to a plane in space, which is at the same distance as the original object was. And with that projection through ray tracing, we come up and arrive at a first order approximation of what the person with an eye defect sees. Said another way, how do I need to modify the letter F such that when you look with healthy eyes at the modified letter F, you arrive at the same distorted perception of the F as somebody with an eye defect looking at the pristine letter F? So, cut a long story short, here are some examples, and I will show a few in a movie in a second. In the center, you see an image of Los Angeles taken from a helicopter, and the correct perception for this image would be literally an inch or so in front of your computer screen. These images are very large. They're like over 40 feet by 35 feet in the dimensions, and you would be about 18 feet away from the screen in order to really have a good perception of this. What you notice is that the central part is fairly sharp. The periphery is distorted and blurred. And that is actually quite similar to what happens in the real eye, because as if you focus on someone or something, that appears fairly sharp and pristine in your vision, but you still notice fellow friends or people around you or things around you. You still notice them, but you do not see them clearly unless you change your gaze. And that is due to the reduced receptor density towards the periphery of the retina. In the upper left corner, this is not the smog which LA used to have a lot. It's actually looking at the scene through a cataract lens. On the upper right, you see what happens when the cataract lens is replaced with a so-called intraocular lens, which is an artificial lens. And if that lens is not implanted correctly and dislocated, you see a double image, like a ghost image on top of the corrected, pristine, clear image. So that's not intended, but we can simulate these things. On the lower left, we show a so-called ring-shaped scotoma or visual field defect, where you don't have an eye lens anymore. You're suffering from aphakia. I mean, the eye lens was taken out but not replaced. And you use an eyeglass to correct for that farsightedness which results from that. And it turns out that the periphery where circled with the cursor is the periphery of the eyeglass. So outside the eyeglass, you still see everything blurry because of the farsightedness, which is not corrected. And then the inner part, which is hard to appreciate because we're again too far away from the actual image. This is over 60 degrees of an opening angle. That is pristine, corrected and magnified vision of the scene. But then there's this thick transition ring where the entire tower, which you see here, vanishes. Why is that important? If you drive in downtown Tucson, let's say 4th Avenue or so, and you have parked cars on the side, if they're just at the right angle and somebody steps onto the street from the curbside, if they happen to be at the right angle and inside that ring-shaped defect, you essentially will not see them until they pop up right in front of you. And on the lower right side, you see an example which many of us can relate to if we're nearsighted. It's an eyeglass corrected severe nearsightedness. And what you see is when you aim with the upper edge of the eyeglass at a point-like object, for example, a fire sprinkler on a ceiling, you see it blurry above the eyeglass and sharp and smaller inside or through the eyeglass because you have a wide angle effect. Now, cut a long story short, we were also able to extend our three-dimensional eye model to model irregular corneal surfaces. And here you see an example. On the left side, you have the so-called emmetropic view of a scene, which is again 12 meters by 12 meters, seen from a distance of 5 meters. So you can see, of course, the text and you see the blurriness in the very periphery. But on the right-hand side, you see a severe case of irregular astigmatism. You see all kinds of blurriness with structure, without structure, like a more diffuse one. And that is exactly where the challenge is to correct astigmatism. It can be corrected with glasses, but more so with contact lenses. You can correct it also with LASIK and other means where you basically reshapen the cornea surgically with a laser. And just wanted to show you that these pictures, by the way, took years ago, hours on a supercomputer. Now times have advanced thanks to Moore's law, which is still happy for now. We can do this now in real time, actually. And I want to show you some of the motion versions. So here we have simple page reading. This is the normal view of reading a page. That's the literature which I read. I'm kidding. Here's the same view now with the astigmatism, where you don't have any correction for it. The same scene. And we're now advancing to a scene where the observer is still, but objects are moving towards the observer. That's the view, which is unimpaired. No eye defect. Now comes the same scene with the astigmatism, uncorrected. And now we advance to a more complex motion where the observer is turning their head. That's again the view without the eye defect. Now comes the same view with the eye defect engaged. And again, every frame of that movie has been ray traced. And finally, we get to the most complex scenario where the observer is actually walking through the scene as we do in daily life. That's in the good old world, back in Germany. Walking through downtown, often a small town. And now comes the same view with astigmatism. So why are these things important? Well, first of all, it's always good to visualize things for people to appreciate what others have to go through. But you can use that tool also to show a patient what they currently see and what they could be seeing if they were to undergo LASIK surgery, for example, so to give them an appreciation for how much improvement they hopefully may be able to expect. Now, so far we have covered the lens of sort of the camera system, which is the eye. We're now working our way to glaucoma. Now, many of you have probably heard of glaucoma, either in families, among family or friends. Glaucoma is the #1 condition causing blindness, which is untreatable. The real #1 blindness causing condition is cataract, as I mentioned, but cataract can be fairly easily taken care of in less than half an hour in a surgery where you get a new eye lens, and then you're, for the most part, good to go again. Not so with glaucoma. Glaucoma is a serious condition, and if untreated, you will have permanent visual field loss, and if truly untreated, and if it progresses, you go blind, and there's no cure currently for it. That's why it's imperative to diagnose glaucoma very, very early on and to monitor the so-called intraocular pressure on a continuous basis, I mean, very frequently, to make sure that it doesn't exceed a certain limit. Now, how does the pressure come into this? And if I can quickly ask Gloria, can you guys still hear me?
I can hear you. I think
Good. Okay.
I assume they all can.
Good. Just want to make sure I'm not accidentally frozen. Good. Thank you. So here we have the eye in the upper left corner, and there's a little box around it, and that box is this magnified view right here. What is important to note is that next to the lens, there's a so-called ciliary body, and that ciliary body produces a liquid. That liquid is called the aqueous. The aqueous protrudes into the anterior chamber, and it exits the eye through the trabecular meshwork through Schlemm's canal and goes into the venous system. Let's see, there's a person. Okay, good. Just admit another person. So basically what's important is the aqueous is constantly produced, but it's constantly drained. So that's what we call a dynamic equilibrium. So it's all in balance. The pressure does not change under normal circumstances. As much as you produce, you drain. The problem with glaucoma is that the trabecular meshwork in Schlemm's canal can be clogged up or blocked to the point where you still produce your aqueous, but the aqueous cannot exit the eye anymore. And of course, you can imagine what happens. The equilibrium gets out of balance and you increase the pressure inside the eye. When you increase the pressure inside the eye, it starts pushing on the optic nerve, and with prolonged exposure, starts killing off the cells of the optic nerve, starting from the outside and proceeding towards the inside of the nerve. Now, the nerve is only 1 millimeter diameter, just to give you an idea. So that means that people suffering from glaucoma first lose peripheral vision, which they may or may not be aware of. And that's exactly why this disease is so tricky, because you don't see it right away that something is missing from your view. By the time you go to the doctor and say, you know what, I really have difficulty seeing in my periphery, at that point, it's already too late for that part of your vision, because that part of your vision is gone. That's why it's extremely important to go frequently to the doctor if there's a predisposition to get glaucoma, and also to check the intraocular pressure. Now, to make things worse, and this is very important for those of you who already went to a doctor to check your eye pressure. Actually, everyone should do that, in my opinion. So what's important is when you go to the eye doctor, they usually use either a so-called Goldmann applanation tonometer, which is a setup where you put your chin on a headrest, chin and headrest, and then they move this blue stamp onto your eye and briefly touch the eye from the outside and measure basically the resistance. In order for that to happen, you need to anesthetize your eye. You get these slightly burning eye drops to anesthetize your eye. And that's how it works, because they actually essentially touch the cornea of the eye in order to assess the pressure. Or you will find a doctor's office which has a handheld tonometer where they put a little sleeve around it and then briefly tap your eye. And that's they still need to anesthetize that part. And then there's other mechanisms where you don't need to anesthetize, where they come up with a device to your eye and there's a little air puff blowing into your eye and they measure the back pressure. Now, while this seems all feasible, doable, and the air puff in particular is convenient because you don't need to anesthetize your eye, the crux with all, and this is important, all external methods is that they all rely on the fact that the individual variations in the density, stiffness, rigidity of the respective cornea of patients do not matter so much. And therein lies the false assumption. I give you two very simple examples to bring that point home. If you have your eye as a steel sphere with nothing inside, there's vacuum inside, but the eyeball wall is made of steel. If I try to dent that steel sphere, I will get an enormous back pressure because you will not be able to dent it. Therefore, I would conclude from the outside saying, oh, geez, this eye is literally about to explode. The eye pressure is way too high. However, you couldn't be more wrong because there's actually no pressure in the eye, in that eye. Now let's use the opposite example, the other extreme. Your eyeball is made of a rubbery skin, but it's a high pressure air balloon. So the eye is actually about to explode, but you have a more rubbery skin. Now, when you try to dent that eye, you will be more successful in denting the eye. So you will actually read a lower intraocular pressure, and you would potentially conclude, well, your pressure seems okay. We'll just leave everything the way it is. Unbeknownst to you, though, that eye is about to explode. So basically, you see these two extremes, and the truth lies somewhere within these two extremes. And there's literature which shows you that these measurements with the devices, which are quite common in doctors' practices, can be off by 50, even 100%. So obviously that is not necessarily the way to go. So in other words, the real true way to go about it is ultimately to have a pressure sensor implanted inside the eye in order to measure the true prevailing intraocular pressure. One more thing, not to try to scare you, but it is important to keep this in mind. Glaucoma is even more tricky than this, and here's why. We have a chart down here where on the x-axis is a timeline for 24 hours. That means a whole day. On the y-axis, you have the intraocular pressure, which is traditionally measured in millimeter mercury. Usual normal pressure, again, that's already where the problem lies. There is no usual, but on over the thumb estimates, your pressure should be around 15, maybe to 17. But again, that highly depends on the patient, on the person. There's some patients, they have 20 plus and they are normal, show no signs of glaucoma. Some others have very low intraocular pressure and have glaucoma. So it's, you name it, it all exists. So that's what makes it tricky. But what makes it more tricky is the fact that when you go to the doctor's office, it's usually after 8 o'clock in the morning and then throughout the day. At that point, the doctor takes the pressure measurement only at that point in time, but there's no measurement or assessment of what happened during the night. And therein lies the problem. You see here between around 5:30 and 7:30 in the morning, there is a tendency for the intraocular pressure to spike, as you see in this rays, which are circled in red. And that is one of the main contributors. These spikes, while you're asleep, can silently kill off more optic nerve cells and further progress your visual field loss. And that part simply doesn't get captured with the measurement at the doctor's office. That's why you need actually something which more continuously or more frequently measures throughout the day your pressure, or said another way, you need something which has a memory and records, in a sense, of what has happened during the night before. I saw there was a question popping up. Gloria, do you see that one by any chance?
Let me look. I'm sorry. Yes, I see there is a number one. Okay. It's from my husband. He says, if glaucoma is incurable, what is the purpose of early diagnosis or early detection?
Oh, thank you very much. Excellent question. The earlier you detect it, the earlier you can take eye drops to mitigate the aqueous production and therefore lower it and lower your intraocular pressure. And or there's surgeries where you use a laser and shoot an opening into the Schlemm's canal. And there's another company, for example, out of San Diego area, where you introduce into that hole which you have created a titanium type tube, metal tube, very tiny tube, to create a permanent drain into the venous system. So it's literally almost like you have a clogged sink and you need to get this unclogged. And the longer you wait and the more severe glaucoma is, and if you don't get it under control early on, the surgeries which result thereafter are far worse, where it gets things like an Ahmed valve and things like that, where you literally put an opening here to drain the eye explicitly. It's a fairly large device, and usually these devices don't, or the effectiveness of these devices go away after about a year because that stuff starts clogging up again. And so it's, you don't want this to progress to that state. So you want to lower the aqueous production, and you want to be able to create an artificial exit one way or the other to allow the aqueous to drain and to maintain the eye pressure. That's why you want to catch it early on. And the other problem is these eye drops, for the most part, cause a burning sensation. So that means if you self-administer, if you ever had put eye drops into your eye yourself, then you do know there's a high chance that you thought you hit the eye, but you actually didn't, or only partially. So in other words, the compliance or adherence to that protocol, the strict protocol to use these eye drops, can be tricky and lacking, and therefore you still progress with vision loss. So the way to go about it would be that somebody else would need to apply the eye drops to your eye to have a good chance to adhere to the regimen to use the eye drops. I hope that answers the question. Having mentioned the intraocular pressure to measure it where it matters, well, we developed at the time a pressure sensor concept, which obviously is not implantable, as you can see here in the size, but the principle of it matters. And I want to go to the next slide to sort of explain how that would work and how it could work. So this pressure sensor device will ultimately be something on the order of 2 by 1 millimeter, with maybe millimeter thickness or less, and can be implanted on the iris in direct line of sight with the outside world, but inside the eye. That device has a capacitor, almost like a battery, and gets optically charged from the outside, for example, with a laser or a light source of a certain wavelength. And then when you go to bed for, let's say, 8 hours, the device stays on, of course, and monitors the pressure. And there's two outcomes that can happen. There's the yellow route down here, and there's the red route up here. And let's first explain the yellow route. If the eye, so the sensor which we discuss here has a threshold built in, which is specific to your eye. And if the eye pressure stays below the threshold, which you set as normal for your eye, then throughout the night, the capacitor does not get discharged in a meaningful way, such that when you wake up 8 hours later, you can now query the device also with a light source from the outside with a different wavelength. And there's a little tiny mini LED which lights up if the capacitor was actually still charged. So in other words, and here you see the light, if you query the device when you wake up and you see a light signal through the device which you used to query the sensor with, that would indicate that the pressure has not exceeded the threshold, at least not for a prolonged amount of time, and you're good. If, however, the upper route gets taken, where throughout the night you have spiking and all kinds of things for extended periods of time, the capacitor gets discharged. That means the whole battery is empty, if you will. You query the device when you wake up, and there's no light signal coming out of the eye. At that point, you know that the pressure at some point in those 8 hours has exceeded the threshold. And at that point, you would need to adjust your drug treatment and probably up the dosage. That's sort of a principle of how this can work. Now, having mentioned a device to actually monitor this, at that time, of course, that slide is obviously dated now, but this used to be a top-of-the-line camera with 5 megapixels. Now compare this to almost 20 megapixels, which we have now on our phones. So it's even better now, but back then even, we developed and devised a special lens and illumination assembly such that you could put that camera onto your own eye by yourself and take a selfie of your own eye. And just to give you an idea, on the lower left, you see an image of a sensor, which is developed by a colleague of mine at Caltech, Dr. Yu-Cheng Tai, which is a passive pressure sensor, but I'm not getting into that at this point. But that sensor is only 1.5 millimeters in diameter. However, you now have a 5 megapixel image of something which is very small. Or said another way, if you look at your penny, the 1 cent coin, and turn it on, you see the backside of it, and you take a selfie of that one, you actually see Abraham Lincoln sitting there, in case you never knew. And so you have turned this this camera into a very cheap, inexpensive microscope, because each of the pixels here is about 1.5 micrometer in diameter. With that, you can put this camera onto your own eye and now see the sensor which is implanted onto the iris in magnification by yourself. By the way, that camera, since my lab, as Gloria knows, also does a lot of research in autonomous systems for space exploration, we also have used it for astrobiological purposes. Went to Red Rock Canyon in Las Vegas, not to gamble, but to actually chase lithophiles, bacteria that like to live in rock. And here you see a boulder field where this boulder is, for example, taller than me. On top of that boulder, you see the varnish. And then if you look a little bit closer and bring the camera onto the surface of that boulder, you see the crystalline structure here. And if you break off a little bit of a surface of that rock, you can actually see that little green layer here. And those are the lithophilic bacteria living there. And just at the right depth to take advantage of light, but also moisture entrapment in the rock surface. And again, beauty is that all of this is taken with the exact same camera, and in of course, different zoom stages, but the camera can be used as a microscope as well. Another device which we developed is easier to handle, and it's something which people doubted would work. And I had a hunch, based on my experience in middle school and high school, that this could actually work. This looks clearly like a binocular. However, it isn't. It is a telescope that is bent around with two prisms here and here, such that the eye, which is being illuminated on the right side, for example, can now be observed with your own left eye in magnification. And the part which people doubted, which turned out to work actually, is that the brain nicely shuts off the eye, which is being magnified, and you can nicely observe the winking of your right eye with your own left eye. And then you flip the whole thing around, and then you can observe your left eye in magnification with your own right eye. So in other words, you have a telescope where the end of the telescope, the opening, is bent onto your other eye, and you observe it in magnification. Obviously, the applications of such devices are plentiful. The intraocular sensors, which I mentioned, to query these devices, either passive or active devices with memory. It's important also to look at drug delivery devices, which will be implanted in the future, so that you have the drugs being administered on a time basis locally where it matters. And of course, you can also investigate the interior chamber of the eye for other clinical purposes. This is quickly how this would work. Here you see again the eye, cornea, pupil opening, the iris. Here would be the sensor in magnification, and the camera would be simply put directly on the eye, and you would see that sensor in magnification. So that is glaucoma for you, and what to watch out when you try to monitor that condition. And again, it needs to be monitored. You cannot, or definitely in your own interest, you should not lapse on that, because it's your own vision. And for glaucoma, there is currently no treatment for the dead nerve fibers of the optic nerve. So that vision is gone. Now, having used the analogy of a camera versus the eye, we have covered the lens system. We've covered parts affecting sort of the chip, if you will, by mangling the optic nerve. But here's another one, and that is, what is if the optics are fine, everything is perfect in the eye, except the receiving end, which is the retina or the chip on the camera, is affected by diseases. And there's two diseases which I would like to draw your attention to, which are quite, well, one of them is very prevalent. The other one is a tragedy. Age-related macular degeneration, or known as AMD, is something, we'll get to the numbers later, but there's about over 200 million people worldwide who have it. And glaucoma, by the way, 1 in 100 worldwide. So there's 80 million people with glaucoma. That's a 1% world population disease. So it's very significant. But coming back to macular degeneration, and the other one is retinitis pigmentosa. So retinitis pigmentosa is an inherited disease. You do not acquire it, and there is currently no cure, and it affects people of all ages. So I get once in a while emails from parents who are very concerned and devastated because their child is suffering from retinitis pigmentosa and will ultimately go blind. There's nothing currently which can be done against retinitis pigmentosa. Macular degeneration is a different story. And just for those of you who are familiar with wet stage AMD and dry stage AMD, there are drugs, so-called anti-VEGF, VEGF, which is the protein that causes the so-called neovascularization of the retina, which causes the wet AMD. That drug can actually stop the progression and give you some of the vision back. Now, the dry AMD, for the longest part, has been sort of an orphan in the sense that there wasn't much in terms of treatment. However, the good news is there's companies out there which have now a few drugs on the market which actually at least stop the progression and potentially also give you some vision back on the dry stage of macular degeneration. So that's something just to keep in mind, and you can ask your ophthalmologist in that regard what's available to you. But coming back to see what the situation is, and let me first explain that slide, and I saw about 2 or 3 questions coming up. Well, here's the eye again, lights coming from the right, going through the eye, and it shows, and we have this little magnification here, which shows the layered structure of the retina. So the retina is a layered structure where the light comes, in this case, through the blood vessels, goes through the neural layers, and then is received at the photoreceptors, which are the rods and cones of the eye. The problem is that these diseases, AMD and retinitis pigmentosa, destroy the photoreceptor layer. Therefore, the person goes blind because of that. And the remaining layers of the retina, though, are still intact. So think of it as a layered wedding cake, where the top layers are all fine, more or less, albeit maybe restructured, but the bottom layer is affected by the diseases. And so what people have done is take advantage of the fact that these layers, which are intact, can still be utilized. Gloria, is there a question currently?
No, those were just exclamations and congratulating you. I'll try to keep an eye on it.
Okay, yep. I know we're running over, but there's still good stuff to come. I hope you bear with me.
Just make it full length. We have 3 hours here.
Yes.
Some people will have to leave, but you don't have to shorten it. It's fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you. So there have been by and large 3 approaches worldwide to the artificial vision implants. So-called epiretinal implant, where you put a chip on top of the retina but inside the eye. A subretinal approach, where you put the chip beneath the retina, and a suprachoroidal approach, where in the choroid of the eye further outside. Epiretinal, suprachoroidal surgeries are fairly straightforward. The subretinal one is more involved, but still well understood. But you have to keep in mind that the retina itself is only 500 micrometers big. That means half a millimeter. So it's quite a surgical feat to get a chip inserted beneath the retina. Now, a lot of that stuff goes back to Hermann von Helmholtz, who has done a lot also in vision. I mean, he was a phenomenal scientist in all kinds of genres of science. But retinal implants, as I mentioned, epi, sub, and suprachoroidal. There's also approaches of the optic nerve implants where, and I have to say something about this. The optic nerve, as mentioned, is a cable, basically, which leaves your eye, goes to the visual cortex, and that cable is only 1 millimeter diameter, but contains about 1 million fibers. Now, the retina of a human eye has about 10 to the 9 photoreceptors. So 1 billion, okay? The cable, the fibers leaving the optic nerve, or which comprise the optic nerve, are 1 million. So there is a 1,000 to 1 intelligent compression of the received pixels, if you will, intelligently processed and efficiently processed, such that you get now a spatiotemporal spike pattern going down the optic nerve into the visual cortex. That's why you can imagine if you wanted to only focus on the optic nerve for stimulation, because maybe the eye is heavily impaired or doesn't even exist anymore, but you have still a viable optic nerve, you would put a cuff electrode around it. But now the stimulation becomes very, very challenging, because you have 1 million fibers which you cannot really tap individually, obviously, because again, it's 1 millimeter diameter and 1 million fibers. So you have to basically use a temporal stimulation pattern to influence the spiking along these fibers. So it's very complex how to do this. And then there's approaches for cortical implants. If the eye wasn't there altogether, you can still intervene in the visual cortex by implanting electrodes directly into the brain. But at that point, you can imagine, since a lot of processing, which I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, has already happened on the retinal level and on the in the level of the visual cortex, the language you have to talk to the eye to give something that can be digested or appreciated by the visual cortex to evoke a certain vision becomes very, very convoluted and very, very complex. So it's hard to understand how that would work. But there's other approaches as well, and I want to show you the electronic tongue stimulator. Oh, I should say up front, these approaches, which I mentioned here, are only successful in people who have been seeing at some point in time where the visual cortex is actually tuned towards vision, and they lost their vision due to diseases and conditions afterwards in life. So for people who are congenitally blind by birth, these approaches will not work because they produce basically gibberish, if you will, for the visual cortex, which has been rerouted for auditory and tactile senses, for example. Because as you know, blind people, who are, especially the ones who are born blind, are extremely good with hearing and tactile senses, right? So in other words, these implants only work for people who are seeing at some point in time. Now, there's an approach which works for everyone. And that's a tongue stimulator, where you see here a test subject who's blindfolded and gets this tongue stimulator on their tongue, because you know the tongue has a lot of receptor density, because if you feel some cavity on your tooth with your own tongue, it feels like the Grand Canyon, because of that magnification effect due to the receptor density. And so it's a perfect spot to actually stimulate. And so what happens is the subject wears a camera on their forehead with which they can, when they turn their head, perceive the surroundings of the space. And that gets processed very similarly to the vision implants, which I'll explain in a second, and then results in a stimulation electrically of these electrodes. That means you feel a sensation on your tongue. If you look at a pillar in front of you and you keep swiveling your head left and right or panning left and right, you will feel a vertical bar on that electrode, a column, sort of being stimulated, but moving from left to right as well. And this approach works for people who are congenitally blind. It works for people who were seeing at some point in time but lost their vision, and it works for us if we're fortunate to have our vision when we're blindfolded. It takes each party maybe a different amount of time to get used to it, but you can actually attain a basic sense of navigation when you do this. The obvious disadvantage of this is you cannot talk and eat at the same time, and that's not to be underestimated, obviously. Now, coming to the approaches, one of them was done by one of my thesis advisors back in Germany, Retinal Implant AG. They used a subretinal implant, which had a very high resolution, over 1,000 pixels. And as you can see, this implant was implanted beneath the retina. So that's exactly the challenging surgery, which is quite well understood. And you see the blood vessel of the retina, which is the top layer of the retina, being actually on top of the chip, and the chip is shining through the otherwise almost translucent part of the retina. So the chip is not on top of the retina, it's beneath the retina, and the blood vessel of the retina is actually on top. So the idea was to use this almost like a solar cell, receive the light from the outside through the natural optics of the eye, and then convert locally the signal into electric stimulation. It turned out that that conversion was too weak and it had to be amplified. So unfortunately, they had to put a cable outside to a battery and to amplify this. Overall, that approach did not pan out as expected. And another approach, which I was heavily involved with through two large center efforts, Department of Energy and NSF, yielded the so-called Argus 1 and Argus 2 implant. And the Argus 2 is the only FDA-approved retinal implant to date. It has as opposed to 1,000 pixels, it has only currently 10 by 6 pixels, so only 60. The way it works is the patient wears glasses, and the glasses is a camera. The camera is being used to record in real-time images around you. Images are being processed and sent inside the eye through a transceiver unit to stimulate a chip which is implanted on top of the retina. So this is an epi-retinal implant, which you see here. Here's the retina. Again, blood layer, neural layers, photoreceptors, the layered structure. Photoreceptors are the ones which are affected by the disease. So the electrode array stimulates the top layers of the retina, which then exit into the optic nerve. And here you see the size of this whole thing. It's about 0.5, so half a centimeter by half a centimeter. This was a large effort, involved 6 national labs, and Caltech, University of Southern California, and UC Santa Cruz. And the NSF effort was also the 3 universities I just mentioned, and well, got plenty of awards and things like that. And here's the image processing part, which I want to draw your attention to. Again, the patient wears glasses with miniature camera, takes images. These cameras can wirelessly transfer the images to an external processing unit, which we get to in a second. That unit downsamples the image, almost similar to the retina, from a high resolution megapixel camera to the few tens of pixels which the electrode array has. And that information is transmitted wirelessly to an intraocular transceiver unit where you send both power and data telemetry, meaning you send the power to power the device, and on top of that modulation, you send the data, so that this transceiver unit via cable stimulates the actual electrode array where it matters, to give you some very basic vision back. Now, here's the thing. Nobody really knows how affected the retina of a particular patient truly is. Everyone has a different disease state. You don't know exactly what part of the retina or to what extent the retina is affected. So what you need to provide such a implant carrier is an ability from the outside to enhance their vision by using filters. And you do that in collaboration with the patient to choose a set of real-time image processing filters to optimize their very limited vision with the implant. And so filters are, for example, of course, the resolution, which needs to match the retinal implant array, contrast enhancements, inversion, grayscaling, equalization of the histogram. For example, here you see me in front of a bright window, so my face is completely dark. But with a particular filter, I can make it such that I can brighten up and show far more detail despite the fact that the sun is behind me. That can all be done with image processing, and you can also do image or edge detection, for example, to help or to offer the patient a set of filters, and in collaboration with the patient, you figure out what works best for a particular patient. Give you an example to make sense to all of this. If you're in a room with a, let's say, white wall and a, let's say, off-white door, with the limited 16 by 16 array, which would be 256 pixels, which is already more than the 60 of the Argus 2, with nothing else, you would see a gray and gray scene, so you wouldn't see much. However, if I engage a grayscale enhancement filter and superimpose on that one a contrast filter, I can make it such for that patient that the wall is completely white and the off-white door appears completely black. So to the point where they can even perceive that there might be an opening or a window in the door. And again, the trick with such limited resolution is not to necessarily read fine print, which is obviously not possible with that, but the trick is to give them basic functionality to navigate obstacles. So the importance is to know that there is a door, that there is an opening, that there is a curb, or an obstacle on the floor, as opposed to knowing that the door is made of mahogany or oak tree. That is beside the point. And that's exactly what we delivered and developed. And that was all laptop based. Now, while that is not necessarily a bad thing, if you had to wear a laptop in a backpack, it's of course still cumbersome. So we looked into miniaturization. And we were able to use this gumsticks processor, and you can see a comparison to a 9-volt battery. With that low computational unit, so it's not very powerful, but then ever since have, of course, increased in power as well, computationally. But with that unit, we were able to process more than 30 frames per second with a high resolution camera and have it battery operated for more than 8 hours. So it becomes highly mobile. That's what you want. Since these chips are still not very ubiquitous, we ultimately developed the system to the point where we can engage, for example, with iPhones, iPods, and iPads, which are, of course, extremely ubiquitous and heavily supported worldwide. So we can now do the real-time image processing and filter selection on such a phone in collaboration with the blind person. Now, important, we have so far covered that we can capture the scene in more or less real time, let's say 15 frames a second, which may be sufficient. And we can downsample intelligently and still enhance with image processing the limited resolution of the implant to provide as useful of a basic vision to the person as possible. However, this is just the fact that we manipulated the image. The image itself, though, the pixelated image needs to still be stimulated, meaning what we have covered so far is only the part from here to here to here. So the reduced image size is now sitting here, but needs to be converted to electric stimulation patterns to evoke the vision of that object, or of that pixelated object. And that part we have not talked about yet. And this is how that works. We use as an example an 8x8 electrode array. And what's important to note is that each electrode has, and again, I'm not going into detail in the interest of time, and also to capture the gist of it. Each electrode is governed by a huge set of parameters. Onset time, the profile of stimulation, the strength, the duration, the pulse width, frequency, things like that, you name it. So too many parameters to fine-tune by hand. Therefore, we came up with a scheme which those of you who wear glasses or contacts go through on a fairly regular basis every couple of years with the optometrist, where you basically get provided a setting and another alternate setting, and you decide which one gives you better vision, and then the optometrist dials in some other prescription and continues that game with you until after 10, 20 iterations or so, you walk out with your prescription. In a very similar way, not assuming the particular disease state of the patient, we use the patient per se as the judging instance to tell you what should change in the stimulation. And who better to tell you than the end user, meaning the patient or the subject themselves with the implant. So this is how it works. Let's say you're supposed to see the letter A. So the camera looks at the letter A, gets a high resolution image, but through image processing, that high resolution image is reduced to the 8x8 array, so you get a pixelated version of it. Now, a naive, although not unexpected approach would be to say, okay, the electrodes which contain a pixel or represent a pixel which is lit should fire at full strength, whatever is sort of biocompatible without frying the retina, and the rest stays quiescent. That would be not a bad approach at first. The problem is that you're stimulating not at a photoreceptor layer where you have this one-to-one correlation, you're stimulating several layers up, because what happens is the retina receives normally the signal here, and then the signal gets processed by going backwards through all the neural layers where the light went through before, and gets processed and does the 1000 to 1 intelligent compression. So you're now stimulating at the end of that compression stage. That means you have to talk actually a different language. And not surprisingly, if you stimulate the way I said in a straightforward fashion, where you think the electrode that represents a lit pixel gets stimulated, then you end up with complete garbage from a perception point of view. So what we have done is to offer the subject a stimulation pattern which results in a certain visual perception, and we offer an alternate with different parameters stimulation, which generates a different kind of perception. And since we told the patient that they need to see a letter A, we let the patient then tell us which of these resulting perceptions is closer to what they're supposed to see. And the patient may make a choice. Of course, there can be errors in that too. But then that pattern they choose, we use in the next iteration and offer it again and modify it with an intelligent algorithm to offer yet another alternative. And then we ask the patient again to tell us which one works better for them and is closer to what they're supposed to see. And then after several iterations, hopefully the patient arrives at, or we arrive at a stimulation where the patient says, yes, I can see the letter A. And that would then be the optimal, or close to optimal stimulation in order for the patient to see the letter A. Now, if you pay attention to this, you will clearly say, this makes no sense at all, because how can I communicate to the patient what they're supposed to see exactly? A, they're blind, and just by me telling them to see a letter A doesn't mean anything, because the letter A can be capitalized, lowercase, italics, Gothic, font, all kinds of fonts. In other words, they have no idea what the letter A really is supposed to look like, but it's crucial to know this in order to drive the patient-driven optimization process. Recognizing this deficiency, we developed a tactile feedback device, which has exactly the resolution of the implant. And with that one, we can dial in precisely what the 8x8 configuration looks like. And since blind patients or subjects are very good with tactile, they now have ground truth right in front of them, which they can feel constantly. And now the optimization process makes sense, because now they can compare the stimulations to the tactile feedback device and can drive that optimization process. Then for the Argus 2, we developed the 6x10 one, which is a smaller version, to also feel what the ground truth is. And just to show you how complex this is, if we go to a 32x32 array, which is close to what the German implant effort had with 1024 pixels, if hypothetically speaking, and there's some evidence that you can actually do that, you can even stimulate color, but let's say you can stimulate gray values. If, just mathematically speaking, each of the 1024 pixels, or let's just call it 1000 pixels, has 256 grayscales. That means you have now a search space of possibilities of 256 to the power of 1024, which is roughly 10 to the power of 2048. That means, by all means and purposes, infinity. Okay, this is a 1 with 2048 zeros. To drive that optimization process, which I outlined before, this one, would take pretty much infinitely long for all means and purposes in order to drive something at a visual perception, which would be the one you desire. However, with intelligent algorithms, we have shown that we can get down to only 5,000, meaning 2,000 45 orders of magnitude fewer iterations, but of course 5,000 is still a sizable number. And we can still reduce this to tens of iterations to get to a decent approximation of what they're supposed to see. And the visual cortex will meet you halfway to use that information to then fill in the rest and get to some useful, it's not perfect, but to some useful information to function. So that's what's possible. Is there a question, Gloria? I saw there was a new question popping up.
Okay, no, it's something like an emoji.
Okay, good. So, leaving the implant area, I had a wonderful student project at the university, which came about by just giving a so-called blitz presentation of 5 minutes of what my lab was doing to neuroscience students. And so I just gave the talk to just showcase what was going on. And lo and behold, several students came after that presentation to me and said they wanted to do a project with me. So we ultimately set out to do one, and it actually turned out really well. So most of us, not all of us, are familiar or have seen people using the so-called white cane, which is a cane to basically scan the floor, the ground in front of you as you walk, to basically see whether there's any obstacles. Now, important is, of course, the cane sort of identifies you pretty much immediately that you have a vision impairment. That's one aspect. But more importantly, from a functional point of view, you usually scan what's on the ground in front of you so that you don't fall over it or run into it. Rarely is the cane used to scan overhanging obstacles above you, like a tree branch and things like that. So that is a challenge. So while the ground is clear, you may still injure your head or so by running into obstacles which are above the ground. So we had this idea to inspired by what most modern cars have on their back bumper, which are these little quarter-sized sensors, which are used, of course, when you back into a parking lot or into your garage to measure distances to obstacles. Those are actually radar sensors. And we kind of thought, well, geez, why not use something like that to at least augment the experience with the white cane and to give the blind person or the vision impaired person more opportunity to evade obstacles. And so we ultimately chose ultrasound sensors, which are even cheaper, but quite capable. Here are the sensors. And we capture the sensor signal, which is the proximity from obstacles, using a so-called Arduino board to process that. But what's important is the concept. We linked the distance measured by these sensors to obstacles and walls via a processing scheme to a set or a belt of vibrating motors, which you put on the upper rib cage of your body. So the sensors in future versions can be made quite inconspicuous, where you could conceivably maybe think of potentially getting rid of the cane, although that's not the goal and not currently advisable, but it augments the experience. So in other words, now you use this sensor configuration and put it on a belt, as you can see here. Again, it's too large, but it's just the concept that matters at this point. And you have several of these to give you a surround experience. And we have worked with a blind faculty member together. And in preliminary experiments, we found that there's not much of a point having a sensor in the back unless an obstacle were to approach you from the back. But usually you wouldn't walk backwards per se, but you move forward. But either way, that's a minor point. You can have sensors also in the back, not a problem. Each of them has a certain attention cone where they can measure obstacles in that respective area here, 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 and here. And as I mentioned, you have the belt right here, which sends out the signal and receives the distance to obstacles. And then you, via the processing unit, you tie this to a stimulation or vibration belt on your upper rib cage, where each sector which senses an obstacle will start vibrating in that region of your body. And the vibration is proportional to the distance or the proximity of the objects. In other words, the closer the object, the stronger the vibration. And that gives you a sense of orientation where things are coming from or where you are walking into. So just wanted to show this. These things are possible. And of course, this can all be cleaned up and made very elegant. The vibration belt you would never see. That would be an undergarment. And the sensing belt can also be done more inconspicuously, of course, albeit you have to do it above your t-shirt, obviously. So with that, I want to get to two more topics, and these ones are very important from a diagnosis point of view. And this is a worldwide, it's a deployed system for over 25 years now, and it's a worldwide accessible visual field test. I have to say a little bit about the visual field of a person, of all of us. The visual field can be likened to an island of seeing in a sea of blindness, if you will. Why is that? Because we clearly cannot see behind us. So obviously there's a natural shoreline, right? Also, the macula in our retina is the area of sharpest vision. That's where you can see the most with. That's where you read, recognize faces, drive, and so forth with. That sort of resembles the peak of the island, where the sharpest vision is, the highest contrast sensitivity, and so forth. Now, you can impress your ophthalmologist when you get to the practice next time and do visual field testing. That's what it's all about. There's two terms which you need to be familiar with. One is called perimetry. Perimetry, as the name suggests, checks out the perimeter, the extent of the island. So how far to the left and right can you see without turning your eye? And you can do this yourself by stretching out your arms horizontally and then moving the finger or the hand slowly back into your field of vision. And then wherever you start seeing it, that would be the perimeter at that point. Now, perimetry then basically assesses only the extent of the island, but it doesn't give you any details of the center of the island, whether the mountain is still high or still there, or whether there's holes or canyons and so forth. It doesn't tell you that at all. That is done by chempimetry. Chempimetry spot checks, showing by these little parachuters here. It spot checks certain areas of the island and gives you precise information of the altitude, meaning it gives you precise information of, let's say, acuity or retinal contrast sensitivity at that location. So this one gives you the information you need about the interior of the island, but only at spots, at certain locations. So in other words, it does not give you the perimeter of the island. So wouldn't it be nice to somehow combine perimetry and chempimetry to get the best of both worlds? Well, first of all, let me give you an example of chempimetry, and some of you may be familiar with it. This one is a German system, which is now probably outdated, but the technology is still the same. But in the upper inset right here is a system which is very prevalent in the United States. It's a Humphrey visual field analyzer, but the principle of the two is exactly the same. Patient puts the head on a chin and headrest. One eye is covered. One other eye looks through a correction lens if the patient needs eyeglasses or correction. And then they focus on a central fixation marker in a dark room, and then light stimuli pop up like stars in the sky. When they pop up, you're supposed to push a button, but you're not supposed to look around. So you have to stay focused on that central fixation marker. And by spot checking, you do exactly the chempimetry. Now, There's another device which some of you may be familiar with, and that is the so-called Emsler grid. And that one is just a piece of paper which the ophthalmologist gives you into your hands. And then you're supposed to cover one eye and then look with the other eye at the central spot here, and then use a pencil and draw outlines of where you cannot see the grid lines or where they're distorted. The problem with this is, well, first of all, it gives you the perimeter. It gives you also some interior information, but at only one grid contrast. If you were to change the contrast of the grid, make it easier or harder to see, you would be able, okay, I need to show this a little bit later, but you would be able to slice through this island or so-called hill of vision at different altitudes. And we'll get to that in a second. We translated this paper chart into a far more controlled and useful digital version by using touch screens. So again, chin and headrest, dark room, patient is on the chin and headrest, focused on the central fixation marker, and now uses their bare finger to draw on the grid the areas of the grid which are visible or not visible to them. They surround them. Here's an iPad version because we can do this also in a mobile fashion. And here you see the central fixation marker, which in our case actually changes its shape. That means you can actually, you don't, the central fixation marker does not fade away because it gets refreshed. That's very important. Most patients tend to lose the fixation, and therefore the whole exam is useless. And of course, one thing I forgot to mention, these exams can take tens of minutes. So if after half an hour of testing, you lose fixation, then everything was for nothing. So here's how it would work. Patient fixates on that fixation marker and then uses their finger to, let's say, in this area, they cannot see the grid, and this area, they cannot see the grid, while focusing on the marker. You would ask yourself, how can they do this? Well, they use so-called proprioception, and that is what we learn as children once we're born, to relate the position of our fingers in space to our vision, and especially using peripheral vision. So you can basically outline with your finger, while not changing your fixation, the areas which are missing. We fill that part in, and then we adjust the grid contrast. So you see, this one was a very stark contrast. This is a very light contrast. That means the grid is harder to see. If it's harder to see, a subtle defect all of a sudden shows up more prominently because the grid already is harder to see. And therefore, the patient might draw larger areas of where the grid is not visible. And we do this at different contrast levels. And therefore, here's the hill of vision now, or the island. We can slice at the island at different altitudes to capture defects. And here's how it goes. If this is the circumference of the perfect hill of vision with no defects, and here's now a visual field defect, right here, there's a depression in your contrast sensitivity. If you use the standard Emsler grid, which only looks at absolute defects at the bottom of the island, you will miss that relative defect completely. If, however, you lighten the grid contrast, at some point you start slicing through that defect as well. And of course, the utmost grid, which you cannot see, would be the one which is white on white. That would be even above the macula or the fovea. So in other words, by changing the contrast, you have actually a chance to catch subtle or so-called relative visual field defects. And that technique with our system works also for macular degeneration, which the Humphrey visual field analyzer cannot be used for really, because patients cannot see the central fixation marker and they lose fixation. Here's what you get as a result. On the x-axis, you have the horizontal of the visual field, the y-axis is the vertical, and the z-axis, the third dimension, that's why it's called the 3D computer-based threshold Emsler grid test, gives you the contrast sensitivity of the retina. That means if everything was perfect, you would see that yellow plateau across the board. In this case, you see a severe depression, similar to the lavender pit mine in Bisbee. And so that means that person has a severe central visual field defect. They are not able to drive, not able to read, not able to recognize faces, but they can still use their peripheral vision for general orientation. And you can mimic this yourself. Get some glasses, whether you have them already, or get some glasses without prescription, and put a round sticky note or sticker right in the center of your eyeglass. And then try to walk through your house with that. I mean, you shouldn't do it, but try it by sitting and see how tough it is to not orient yourself. Now, we have done many clinical studies since 2000 on this. Here you see an early detection of macular degeneration. That defect is fairly small in diameter, but it's an absolute defect already. That one may get lost, or it may not be detected with the Humphrey visual field analyzer. Here's an example of glaucoma, where the upper hemisphere of your visual field, which is the cliff beyond that plateau, is missing from the field of vision. And we have also done early glaucoma suspect studies where you see the early onset of glaucoma already with the system in the periphery, as mentioned before, and which you would not see with the Humphreys, which you see here, which are rather normal. And in stark contrast, here you see a full-blown case of glaucoma where the patient's vision is only that little mesa. That means they can only at most see maybe a face, but nothing else around it. It's exactly the opposite of the macular degeneration experience. They have tunnel vision. They literally see only a small central area. Everything else is dark. And you see this correlates nicely with even the Humphrey in this particular case. So that one I skip for now and get to the last chapter. And I appreciate that you're still with me. Smartphone-based handheld ophthalmic examination devices. Well, let me quickly go through the motivation. In civilian life, there's many conditions, as we know: macular degeneration, glaucoma, diabetic retinopathy. And if nothing else of this talk, please take these numbers in, and that shows you what we're up against worldwide. Glaucoma, currently 80 million roughly, 1 in 100, that means 1% of the world population, is likely to increase to 111 by 2040. Macular degeneration, 200 million roughly, to increase to 288. Diabetic retinopathy, about 150, going to 234 by 2045. So those are pretty much epidemics in blindness to happen if untreated and if undetected. Of course, not only civilian life has these things, but in the military setting or in the space environments, because NASA's goal to go back to the moon and to Mars with the Artemis Gateway programs, and of course settlement on Mars as well. This will be important for long-term spaceflight, low-gravity environments. But of course, in the military, you have things such as, explosions, pressure waves, and acute injuries to the visual and ocular system. In all cases, early detection and therapeutic countermeasures will, of course, help mitigate the long-term consequences, but also from a economy point of view, if you detect these things early and start countermeasures, it has a significant savings potential in healthcare costs. Now, often we face this type of scenario where fairly trivial tasks are overdone with technology, and where the technology would be better off used in areas where it really matters. But here, this is sort of meant as a joke. The person is just trying to get a new prescription for their glasses. So they have the so-called phoropter in front of their eyes. But instead of the ophthalmologist dialing in the setting, Robonaut, mounted on the Canadian arm of the International Space Station, is doing it for them. So that's sort of the overkill when it comes to these trivial tasks. But technology, of course, matters where it matters, but not for these trivial tasks. Anyways, the point is, and let me actually give the whole slides, that the smart ophthalmic paradigm which we created the gist of it is to provide quality and comprehensive ophthalmic health care to people who are either geographically dispersed, for example, in rural or remote areas, or work and operate in austere environments such as the military theater, space, third world countries, or areas of natural disasters. So the point is, you want to bring the healthcare to the patient rather than the patient to the clinic, which is not always possible. And when you do that, you can discover things early on and mitigate early on. And again, the themes for that is mobile health and telehealth. So to make some sense in all of this, give you concrete examples. These are classic instruments which you will find in a doctor's office: the ophthalmic microscope, ophthalmic slit lamp, and the ophthalmoscope fundoscope. Very expensive devices, tens of thousands of dollars, but what's more important is they're stationary. They're in the doctor's office. You do not fly them in space because it's very expensive to lift even a kilogram up into space. You don't have the space for it on the space station and things like that, but they're fixed installations. Turns out, though, with the increasing resolutions of iPhones or any kind of phones, Androids and so forth, smartphones in general, we can now, with optical extensions, turn them into similar examination devices. Here again are the two perimeters, bulky, they're not mobile at all, but we can now do the whole thing on an iPad, which might be in use for other purposes, especially on a space station. And software obviously doesn't cause any payload or weight or mass. It's just software. That means if you use the iPad for other purposes, you just load another app and you're in business. That led to what we called and termed smart ophthalmics. The paradigm is to develop optical extensions. This one is a commercial one available, which you can either buy or develop yourself for various purposes. What we did then is we developed the apps for the phones to actually conduct the exam, obtain the data, and then, that's important, use the internet or the cell phone capability to transfer the high resolution images to a cloud server farm to process these images, and then seconds later, get the results of the analysis displayed back on your examination phone in situ. So there you have a telemedicine or telediagnosis capability where you can go to the patient and in situ examine the patient by taking advantage of the cloud to get the analysis right back onto your phone, and then make a judgment on whether the patient needs to go see a clinic or can be treated locally. So you can do the triage right there and then. And just to conclude, just give you a few examples. Remember, this was our ray tracing simulation. We can now do this on the phone as well. For the SimEye, we take an image with the phone, we select the condition we want to simulate, irregular astigmatism, myopia, or other things. We submit the image over the internet, and literally what used to take 3-4 hours on a supercomputer 25 years ago, 2-3 seconds later, you get the ray traced image back on screen on your phone. Or another example, for glaucoma detection, for example, we use, for example, this extension to take a fundus image. We use our app, which we developed, to submit it. Well, here I did a selfie of myself. You see the fundus right here. And well, let me first finish the story. We take the image, send it through the cloud to the server farm, and get analysis back of the region which matters, which is the optic disc. Why is that important? Remember our glaucoma situation where the pressure builds up and starts pushing on the optic nerve. And there's a so-called cup to disc ratio in the optic disc, and that's the area where the optic nerve leaves the retina and goes into the visual cortex. That cup to disc ratio can be an indicator whether you are predisposed or may develop glaucoma later on. So it's not a definitive indicator, but it's a good indicator to start with, and it's one which is cheap to come by. And therefore, this analysis makes a lot of sense and is important to do. And you can do now the screening with it. And lastly, the visual field testing, which used to require big bulky machines, can now be done with an iPad. And that was actually one of the startups that started commercializing this, where you do this exam, patient looks at the iPad, one eye closed, the other eye looks at the fixation marker, outlines the areas of the grid of not seeing at different contrast levels, sends the results to the cloud, and literally a second or two later gets the 3D depiction back, and here's other conditions as well: glaucoma, macular degeneration, optic neuritis, anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. Those are all conditions which we have shown in clinical tests can be discovered with the test and assessed in basically unprecedented spatial resolution. By the way, optic neuritis is important because it's an indicator of whether you develop multiple sclerosis or not. Turns out, made myself knowledgeable over your lifetime, if you had optic neuritis once, there's a 50% chance that you might get multiple sclerosis. So with that, in summary, smart ophthalmics, as I showed you, of course, it's important for professional medical markets such as paramedics, in situ, optometrists, ophthalmologists, bedside exams. Of course, important for military and hazardous environments markets, because you can do it again in situ. Space applications also, you can use onboard servers which would do the analysis, or you can do it on the phone as well. Of course, mobile health and telehealth are the predominant targets for such devices. And with that, we're finally arrived at the end, and I'm open for questions. And thank you so much for staying on and your attention. Thank you.